Bibliophiles of the internet, if there are two things that often intersect, it's queerness and crime. I don't mean the criminalization of queerness itself, which is all too real, but rather the fact that when fictional queers are somehow involved in crime, it makes for some really great stories. Now, when it comes to queers and crime, there are two very different axes upon which these stories can run, and I'm going to recommend books that fit on both of those axes in a two-part mini book rec series. As always, this is not intended to be an exhaustive list or resource. These are just books that were top of mind that I've read or that I've heard about that I think fit these prompts. The first of which we're tackling today, and it's that old chestnut, be gay, do crime. This might sound like something I don't actually need to say out loud, but with the increasing bean soupification of the internet, I'm going to explicitly say that this category covers books with queer main characters where the characters are committing some kind of crime on the page. They're not just doing bad things, they're not just fucking up tremendously, they're not simply existing within a system that doesn't want them to exist. They have a concrete goal to do something or gain something by illegal means, and the questionable legality of their actions is not going to stop them from getting what they want. With all that said, first, I would be remiss if I didn't use this opportunity to once again shamelessly plug both The Best Bad Things and Rough Trade by Katrina Carrasco. This is a wildly bisexual historical crime thriller following a Latina character in the late 1880s known as Alma, who was actually trained in espionage and working for the Pinkerton Detective Agency as an undercover agent until she was dismissed for bad behavior on the grounds that she tends to disguise herself as a man. She eventually finds work with an old friend named Delphine who basically runs the West Coast smuggling ring, and when product goes missing up in Washington, Alma is assigned to track down the thief and recover the drugs, and to do so she will don her favorite disguise as a scrappy dock worker named Jack Camp. It's no secret that I love this book and its sequel so freaking much. They are both criminally underrated, no pun intended, and they have so much to offer. They're both thrilling, suspenseful, action-packed, gender-fucky in every possible way a story can be gender-fucked, and they have this seductive element of danger that's almost impossible to look away from. Jack is a really dynamic character who isn't afraid to get his hands dirty or take serious risks. It's really satisfying to see Alma stepping into her power and her queerness as Jack. And the mysteries afoot in both stories are just told in such a compelling way. You honestly can't go wrong with either of these books. Next, I have a super underrated book that I don't get enough chances to recommend. That would be I'll Take Everything You Have by James Cleese. This is a queer YA historical story set in the 1930s following Joe, a young farm boy who just moved to Chicago with a singular goal of finding work and making money fast so he can help support the family farm and get his parents out of debt. His cousin sets him up with a job at a hotel working as a server, but then he also decides to let Joe in on a get-rich-quick scheme he has going on the side. Basically, the job is for Joe to start taking French classes that are often attended by affluent families wanting to immerse themselves in the language before traveling abroad to France. So Joe is supposed to get to know them, ask about their upcoming trips, figure out when they're going to be out of town, and pass that information on to someone else who will then rob these families' houses. At first, it seems like a victimless crime, so he accepts, and before he knows it, he's meeting new people, learning about the queer underground scene in Chicago, potentially falling for a mark or two, and also being pulled into the criminal underworld as the scheme quickly begins to go south much faster than he thought. They're not a one-to-one match by any means, but I feel like this book is kind of like if Last Night at the Telegraph Club was crime fiction. I think what it does so well is that it strikes a really fine balance between feel-good, queer, coming-of-age plot points and really intense, dark, gritty glimpses of Chicago's criminal underworld in the 1930s. At the end of the day, I think this book is asking really important questions about how we can know who our true self really is if we never get a chance to be our true self. And just as much as there are opportunities for us to be someone incredible, with that freedom also comes the opportunity to make mistakes. Next is a book that I do recommend every chance I get, including right now. That is Confessions of the Fox by Jordi Rosenberg. This is a truly unique story where queer historical fiction meets crime thriller meets academia meets metafiction. It's about a legendary 18th century thief named Jack Shepherd who was both queer and trans, and the story is following a trans college professor named Dr. Voth who has dedicated his life and career to studying Jack Shepherd and everything about his life. One day he happens upon this unmarked, unofficial manuscript of sorts called Confessions of the Fox. So you, as the reader, are actually reading that manuscript with Dr. Voth's annotations on its contents. And as Dr. Voth is desperately trying to authenticate this manuscript, he realizes that he is not the only person seeking out Jack's story, and it becomes clear that his fate and Jack's fate might actually be much more closely entwined than he thinks. It's been quite a few years since I've read this book, so you might have to fact check me on this, but the metafiction element of the story works so incredibly well because not only do you as the reader feel like you're discovering this document yourself in real time, but all the citations in the footnotes are for sources that actually exist. There's so much about this manuscript that makes you feel like you're actually reading something that the gatekeepers of the world truly do not want you to see. There's so much freedom and beauty and refusal to conform that is celebrated and reclaimed throughout Jack's journey, and that's just one part of what makes this book so incredibly special. This list would not be complete without at least one title from Sarah Waters, so I'm including The Paying Guests by Sarah Waters. This is another piece of queer historical fiction set in South London during the years following the end of World War I. It follows a widow named Mrs. Ray and her daughter Frances who can only afford to keep their property if they rent out their extra rooms. So they take on two new lodgers, Lillian and Leonard Barber, who are a modern young couple who seem perfectly ordinary at first glance, but the longer they stay, the more Frances and her mom realize that they might secretly harbor some outlandish tendencies and desires. And to make things even more complicated, Frances finds herself falling for Mrs. Barber, and the two eventually embark on an illicit affair that could very well tear both of their lives apart. What's so great about this book is that there's a quietly building intensity to it. At first glance, it seems like a straightforward historical drama about an illicit affair between two closeted women, but that romance comes to fruition much more quickly than you would expect, which leaves room for the story to take several jarring turns in the second half. I don't want to say too much more because the twists and turns are very much worth experiencing firsthand, but especially for a story set just after World War I in an incredibly broken and desperate iteration of London, this story is really capitalizing on that atmosphere and that dreary historical context. Next, I simply have to recommend at least two books by Cat Sebastian. The first is The Queer Principles of Kit Webb. This is a queer historical romance. It follows Kit, who's actually a retired and reformed thief who now owns and operates his own coffee shop, and his one goal is to just live out a quiet existence. But those hopes are quickly dashed when a haughty, eccentric noble named Percy tracks him down, wanting to hire him to steal a very important book containing information that could bring down a very powerful, dangerous man. Initially, Kit refuses the job flat out, but Percy is infuriatingly persistent. So as a compromise, Kit agrees to instead teach the young noble everything he needs to know to pull off this heist on his own. This was, I believe, one of the first books, if not the first book, I read from Cat Sebastian, and it's still one of my favorites to this day. If you're looking for a story about a truly unlikely odd couple gradually growing fonder and fonder of each other against their will, spending lots of time flirting in a cute little coffee shop, and eventually joining forces to take down the rich, you can't do much better than this. The other Cat Sebastian book I want to recommend is sort of a companion to that book. It's set in the same world as Kit Webb. It's called The Perfect Crimes of Marian Hayes. This is another queer historical romantic romp and love story between two bisexual thieves. The story begins when a highwayman named Rob discovers something especially scandalous about Marian's marriage to the Duke of Clare, so naturally he writes to her announcing that he will be blackmailing her to keep his silence. She writes him back to critique his incredibly poor blackmailing technique and let him know that she refuses to pay his ransom, and they end up becoming like snarky pen pals in the process. Eventually, Marian does end up murdering her husband in order to escape a truly horrible marriage, and now the only person she can think to ask for help is Rob, even though she maybe ends up kidnapping him before she can ask for his assistance. This, once again, has all the hallmarks you'd come to expect from any Cat Sebastian book. It's deeply romantic, it's hilarious, the characters are ridiculous, the banter is so incredibly clever and delicious. But there's also a really great parallel between the characters as they're both trying to outrun their problems, and eventually they both have to learn how to face those problems instead. Basically, this is a super fun romp about two bisexual criminals committing some light crime throughout the countryside as they fall in love and try to outrun their past and their mistakes. What else could you possibly want? Then we have a more recent release from an author who I feel like goes hand in hand with Cat Sebastian. I am of course referring to How to Fake It in Society by K.J. Charles. This came out in early spring. It's another queer historical romance set in 1821 and following a noble known as Nicholas, whose mother was infamous for stealing a priceless diamond necklace meant for Marie Antoinette. Now Nico hopes to restore his mother's wrongfully ruined reputation, but first he has to raise a significant amount of funds, and to make things even more complicated, the Bourbon dynasty responsible for his mother's death is now hot on his trail and threatening his own life. Then there's Titus, who once was a simple shopkeeper until he found himself suddenly married to an immensely wealthy woman, a woman who's now searching for a new heir to inherit her fortune after she dies. As word begins to spread about this fortune, Titus finds himself the target of every scammer and con artist in London, including Nico himself. And when Nico receives an offer to work in Titus's household, it seems like the perfect opportunity to make some easy money. That is, until he begins to fall for the very man he needs to cheat. I haven't read this one myself, though I do plan to, so I can't speak to the quality or what the story is trying to accomplish, but I do think it sounds intriguing, and I do love a good historical romance where a con artist accidentally falls for their mark. While we're talking about queer historical crime stories, we have to talk about A Million to One by Adiba Jagradar. This story is pitched as the literal Titanic meets Ocean's 8. The story follows 4 young women, a thief, an artist, an acrobat, and an actress, who seem to have no connection to each other at first glance, but they are united in a singular goal: to steal a jewel-encrusted book stowed away on the RMS Titanic. This is another book I haven't read myself yet, but it's been on my radar for quite some time. And honestly, this was a super easy sell for me because I will happily read anything and everything that even remotely has to do with the Titanic, so I think I'm for sure going to enjoy it in that sense. I went back and forth on whether I should include this next title, but I think I would be remiss if I didn't include If We Were Villains by ML Rio on this list. This is a mystery thriller with a dash of dark academia set against the backdrop of an elite art conservatory where 7 fourth-year students are part of the school's theater program, where they spend every minute of every day studying, reciting, and performing Shakespeare's works. Over the years, they've all become sort of pigeonholed into playing the same kinds of roles over and over: the hero, the villain, the temptress, so on and so forth. But when the cast list for their next production majorly shakes things up, it unleashes a well of untapped resentment, suspicion, and paranoia between them that continues building up to a boiling point until onstage drama spills over into real life and one of them is found dead. It's been a couple of years since I read this book, but it remains one of my most memorable reading experiences in so many ways. There's really fascinating commentary on the parallel experiences of performing something and living through something, which is a process actors have to do simultaneously in real time. And the way the story builds tension between the characters through literal performance is really, really interesting. This is such a deeply dark, fucked up story populated by incredibly toxic, twisted characters, and it will keep you guessing until the very last page. When we're talking about Be Gay, Do Crime, I think 2 obvious picks would be Hammajang Luck and the Obake Code, which are both written by Makana Yamamoto. These are written by a queer and gender nonconforming Native Hawaiian author, and they are both queer sci-fi heists. The first book, Hammajang Luck, is pitched as Ocean's 8 meets Blade Runner. The story is about Edie, who spent 8 years behind bars after taking the fall for their ex-lover and ex-partner in crime when their last job went horribly wrong. Now Edie has gotten a chance for early parole, arranged by none other than Angel, their ex. And of course, Angel has so kindly made these arrangements because they want to offer Edie the chance at one last job, a heist that will finally take down the trillionaire tech god who runs the very space station where they live. Both of these books are incredibly fun and entertaining to read, especially where the first book is concerned. If you're looking for an oops all lesbians heist with all kinds of cool sci-fi tech and enough time spent on the characters actually forming a comprehensive plan before they act, then this would be a great choice. Next is a more backlist fantasy heist that is fairly well beloved. That would be Among Thieves by MJ Kuhn. The story follows a character named Raya who spent the last year earning herself a reputation as the quickest, deadliest blade in the dockside town of Kerouac. However, Raya is not actually her real name. She has spent the last 6 years in hiding in order to protect a deadly secret, but now her path has led her directly into the heart of the Guildmaster's stronghold, and she'll have to assemble a crew of miscreants, smugglers, and thieves if she wants to pull off her plans that will finally win her freedom at long last. This is another book I haven't read yet myself, but it's been on my TBR for literal years at this point. The few times I've seen someone actually talking about it online, it seems to always be having its praises sung. I've heard it's a really great duology as well, so this could be a good one to look into if you're in the market for a badass queer fantasy heist spearheaded by a ragtag crew of misfits. Penultimately, I'd love to recommend a recent read of mine that I quite enjoyed. That was The Feywild Job by C.L. Polk, and I'd especially recommend the audiobook, which is read by Vico Ortiz. This is part fantasy heist, part second chance romance. It's about a non-binary thief named Seldian who happily traded their heart and their ability to fall in love in exchange for a powerful boost of charisma and shape-shifting magic. This magic, as you can imagine, has helped them greatly throughout the years as they've led a very successful life as a con artist, but when one of their grifts goes sideways, they catch the attention of a mysterious and powerful patron with a job offer they simply can't refuse. The job is to steal back a magical gem known as the Kiss of Enduring Love and return it to its rightful owner in the Feywild without them ever realizing it was missing in the first place. And to make things even more complicated, Seldian learns that their ex-friend and ex-partner in crime, Kel, has also been recruited to pull off this heist. I talked about this one recently in my July wrap-up. As I mentioned in that video, this is officially licensed D&D IP, basically basically it's set in a trademark D&D realm, and the author was approached to write a story within that realm. But even with that said, you don't need to know anything about the Feywild or about the D&D gaming system in order to enjoy this story for what it is. In fact, I think C.L. Polk does a really great job of imagining this epic, whimsical fantasy heist that very much feels like a campaign you could actually play in D&D, while also crafting these fully realized characters who you want to root for and who are strong enough to absolutely stand on their own merits. And lastly for today, I thought I would show some love for another underrated favorite of mine. That is The Duke Steals Hearts and Other Body Parts by Elias Cold, which is also great on audiobook for the record. This is a very peculiar queer historical fantasy story that involves necromantic magic. It follows a young trans boy named Philip who has the ability to remove people's body parts from their body using magic. He decides to capitalize on this ability as a con artist, and he basically steals people's body parts and then ransoms them back to their owners for a hefty price. One day, as he's targeting his next mark, that mark claims he can't pay the ransom for his missing nose because his sister is the sole breadwinner of the family and she has recently gone missing. So not wanting to miss out on potentially a huge payout, Philip decides to disguise himself as a duke so he can gain access to the nobility and question them to see if they know anything about this missing sister. And in the process, not only does he begin to fall for the aforementioned missing sister, but he stumbles upon a much darker plot involving not just one, but several abducted young girls. When I first read this last year, I described it as a bizarrely charming historical fantasy that has so many interesting macabre elements and sensibilities, and I absolutely stand by that assessment. It's a very dark story in many ways, but it's also quirky, and the necromantic magic is such a surprising touch in this historical setting. It seems like it shouldn't work at first glance, and yet it absolutely does. And there are so many worthwhile ideas being explored in this story, from the fact that trans youth especially often have to make difficult choices for themselves in order to survive, and that doesn't mean they should be vilified for those choices, to the fact that we can't control how other people feel about us or perceive us, but we can control how we show up in the world and how we show up for the people around us. This is, again, another incredibly underrated, underread book that I love so much and truly cannot recommend highly enough. So there you have it. Those are a handful of books that fall into the realm of be gay, do crime. Again, this is not intended to be an exhaustive list by any stretch of the imagination, and if you know of any other books that fit this brief, please do share with the class and leave those down below in the comments. Part 2 of this mini book rec series should be coming soon, so keep an eye out for that. But in the meantime, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself and others, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.